Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World. I'm your host, Diana Skaya. Two longtime foes who've been battling nearly 4 decades of war, Armenia and Azerbaijan, are headed to Washington on Friday, aiming to finalize a peace deal decades in the making. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump is hosting, hoping for a breakthrough and possibly even a Nobel Peace Prize. But is a signature likely, or is this just another diplomatic show waiting to unfold? Joining me now to discuss is Richard Giragosian, the founding director of Regional Studies Center. Richard, thank you so much for being with us here on World Talks this morning. Now, Richard, let me jump straight in. I mean, here we have, two countries that have fought a bloody war for nearly 4 decades, back and forth over Nagorno-Karabakh in 2023. Azerbaijan reclaims the territory. Over 100,000 ethnic Armenians there's an exodus of them into Armenia proper. And now we have present-day Witkoff, who is in Russia. An August 8th ceasefire deadline for Moscow. And on the sidelines, here you have two former Soviet republics, now Armenia and Azerbaijan, meeting with Donald Trump to try and discuss this long-awaited peace deal. Now, I want to ask you first and foremost, how do you think that these two events are interconnected, and what do you think will come out of this? I mean, what do you predict will come out of this?
Well, that's a good question, Diana. And there are two observations. First of all, the meeting of the Armenian prime minister with the Azerbaijani president on Friday is actually the latest in a new momentum of diplomacy. It follows a bilateral summit that was held only last month, and there is ground for optimism in terms of progress. At the same time, the last several years have witnessed a dangerous validation of Azerbaijan's use of force. So this welcome return to diplomacy is long overdue. Having said that, it's also notable of the absence rather than the participation of Russia. In other words, Russia remains overwhelmed by its failed invasion of Ukraine and seems in a much weaker position. But this is a temporary situation, and we do expect Russia to at least try to regain its lost power and influence. Therefore, for democratic Armenia, the key now is resilience and garnering post-war stability in this diplomacy with Azerbaijan.
Richard, what's in it for the Trump administration into having Azerbaijan and Armenia really finalize this peace deal?
Well, it's quite interesting because the meeting at the White House is as much about Donald Trump and his ego as it is about the Armenia or the Azerbaijan side. In other words, what we see is serious questions over the sustainability of American commitment and interest. And at the same time, there is a danger that the Trump administration's rather naive approach is seen as yet another real estate deal by President Trump, rather than a genuine Western investment in a lasting, durable peace. So the Washington meeting in some ways is helpful, but it's more a diversion from the direct diplomacy between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
What about any obstacles, Richard, that you see unfolding?
Well, the largest obstacle, of course, is Azerbaijan's maximalist diplomatic position, where consistent and consecutive concessions and compromises have been matched by rather aggressive rhetoric coming from the Azerbaijani side. And the real test here is whether a bilateral peace treaty, diplomatic negotiations, whether these will be enough to satisfy the family-run government in Azerbaijan. And the second obstacle is, as we've mentioned, the absence of Russia. Will Russia actually become more of a spoiler in this post-war scenario? We don't yet know.
Richard, let me ask you this. I do believe, though, another main factor here that should be noted is the Zangura. I mean, I won't call it a corridor, but I'll say the Zangura transport route, right? In the province of Sunik, so Armenia proper, and which Azerbaijan wants to, have to, or can I say control, if that's the proper word to use, to link it to its enclave of Nakhichevan and connect it also to the Turkic world. How is that looking, and will this be discussed among other things on Friday? And of course, there were reports that the United States would actually be able to control this. What can you tell me on that?
Well, this is really the major incentive for everyone to secure a post-war stability or peace. In other words, although the meeting Friday is publicly more centered around a draft bilateral peace treaty, the real issue and the most promising element is actually the restoration of road and rail connections through southern Armenia. This is a win-win, and it also offers Armenia two strategic advantages. One is overcoming isolation, where Armenia becomes a more significant transit state. And second, economic interdependence as the most effective way to regain deterrence, to prevent Azerbaijan from renewing the use of force. And for the Azerbaijani side, it gives that country long desired access by land and rail to its exclave on the other side of southern Armenia. But the real sticking point here is there can be no threat or undermining of Armenian sovereignty or territorial integrity. Whatever the details operationally of the road and rail connections, this cannot be any weakness or threat to Armenian sovereignty. And this is where the negotiations seem to be stalled in terms of the right of inspection of cargo, etc. And the U.S. may actually play a role facilitating the resolution of this issue.
Richard, there's also reports that Trump's administration wants to discuss with Azerbaijan to make it to get Azerbaijan to be part of the Abraham Accords. Is this another thing that we could possibly witness on Friday?
Well, yes, because we've already seen preliminary proposals from the Trump administration to include or offer inclusion to both Armenia and Azerbaijan in a rather preliminary expansion of the previous Abraham Accords. What this will do would further allow the U.S. to have a direct role in regional developments. But I really think the more effective actor here, especially from a Western perspective, is the European Union, which is actually much more key to the longer aspect of ensuring peace the day after the peace treaty is signed. So while we do expect the U.S. to push this issue, I'm not sure it's going to be accepted very easily.
Richard, and you just said key words there, the day after. Say, a significant peace deal is finalized and it's trying to be, have been finalized for months, if not years now. What happens the day after?
Well, that's the ultimate question, Diana, because what we see is, to the credit of both sides, they've concluded negotiations over a draft peace treaty. But I'm worried as an analyst that this peace treaty does not include any international observation or monitoring, nor is there any international guarantee or guarantor to ensure a lasting, durable peace. And the punitive nature of this so-called peace treaty is also troubling. But this is why the real aspect or challenge will be the restoration of road and rail links in terms of economic interdependence. And the burden here is much more on Azerbaijan than it is on Armenia, which has long been willing to agree to post-war peace.
And Richard, my final question to you, what role does the EU play in this and how the situation would unfold?
Well, much to the credit of the European Union, we see a degree of engagement in Armenia that's unprecedented. The deployment of EU monitors to southern Armenia, which has been the area targeted by the Azerbaijani military. We also see unprecedented security assistance from the EU to Armenia, similar to Ukraine. And that is not just a reward for the democratic credentials, but it's a recognition by the EU that Armenia is endowed with a quality of legitimacy and stability that's missing from its neighbors. So I do think the EU is finally fulfilling its ambition as a geopolitical player in this region.
And ultimately, can we see some sort of success tomorrow?
Well, we already do. In other words, success is represented by the fact that we have a meeting. That in and of itself, in terms of demonstrating that the momentum of diplomacy is continuing, is deepening, that should be welcomed because the starting point is not even zero, it's negative. So that any such diplomatic engagement is welcomed as progress.
Thank you so much, Richard Giragosian, Founding Director of Regional Studies Center, for all your input with us here on World Talks.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching.